Welcome to Sustainability Unplugged, a podcast by Olive Gaea where we engage industry leaders in candid conversations at the intersection of sustainability, innovation, and corporate responsibility. I'm Jessica Scopacasa, your host and co-founder of Olive Gaea. In today's episode, we will try to understand what is going on with the EU climate policy. Not long ago, the EU was charging ahead with the Green Deal, the EU Taxonomy, CSRD, and a host of other ambitious climate measures. But now, things seem to be shifting, and fast. The political climate is changing, the so-called Omnibus proposal has entered the picture, and many businesses are left asking, what's happening now, and where is this all going? To answer these questions, I'm very pleased to be joined by Pietro Valladuzza, the CEO of Kickstart Group, a boutique consultancy based in Italy and Greece, specializing in climate policy, sustainable finance, and ESG. With over 15 years of experience, he advises EU public and private entities on managing climate-related risks and navigating evolving compliance frameworks. Pietro, welcome to Sustainability Unplugged.
Hi, Jessica. Thank you very much.
So let's kick this off. Pietro, can you just help us understand what is happening in Europe? What is this omnibus regulation and why it's getting so much attention right now?
Yeah, sure. It's not an easy topic, Jessica, as you might understand, because the two packages of the omnibus proposal are creating a kind of delay in everything related to the ESG policies in Europe. At the end of last year, President von der Leyen announced that the European Commission would like to, put forward and to streamline the ESG European regulation with this omnibus simplification package. And the name itself of the package, simplification, should highlight the fact that the European Commission recognized that there are too many frameworks in Europe related to sustainability, and that the work that is required to be done from companies, European companies, but also not European companies, is very, very huge, because we have the CSRD, so we have the directive that is the new obligation for companies to report on their sustainability performance. Then we have the CSDDD, so the directive on the let's say, due diligence that companies should do, taking responsibility in the supply chain. Then we have, as you mentioned, the European Taxonomy, which was streamlined mostly to allow financial flows to go to green activities. And finally, the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is a little bit different in the scope, but at the end of the day is related to track the embedded emission of goods imported inside the European Union, and therefore to reduce and to achieve the overall goal of net zero by 2050. The Omnibus Package has two main, let's say, lines. The first one, it's called Stop the Clock, because it's about to postpone some of the obligations, so to make this obligation the same, real, but later on, so starting from 2027 or even 2028. The other part of the Omnibus Package, the Omnibus Package 2, instead is changing something in consideration of the difficulties for companies to collect all the information that they need to collect to be compliant with the regulation, and also to reduce the number of data points. So there are several layers that we need to understand together today, I think, Jessica. And of course, one of the main topics about all the package is understand how the proposed amendments can generate action and reaction from companies. First of all, they need to stay informed. And this is really the very first message that I want to give you with you today. Stay informed, because the Omnibus Package is something dynamic, and we really need to understand what it will be during all the 2025, the real development of the legislation.
Absolutely. So, Pietro, how would you call this simplification and delays? Are they simply technical adjustments, a necessary sort of recalibration in front of the challenges that companies face in gathering the data and complying with these policies? Or is there something a little bit deeper, a political shift in Europe, a policy setback, if you will?
Oh, this is a tricky question, Jessica. I mean, the political pushback, it's something that we really don't like to talk about in Europe because, we made of the Green Deal our main policies, and the European Union is trying to take the leadership on everything related to sustainability and green in general within a very stringent framework that we had in Europe. On the other side, the genesis of the Omnibus is a report made by Draghi about the risk of reduce the competitiveness of European companies, taking into consideration all the European frameworks and all the European obligations in relation to sustainability. So from the stop of the clock and the postponing the implementation and the national implementation of the directive has two phases, because from one side, to postpone the moment that things are getting real, give the European Commission also the possibility to adjust on the topics and to adjust on what it really matters. Of course, now we are living in a very strange situation overall in the world, because we have the new tariff war in Europe. We are still suffering from the Ukrainian-Russia conflict. We are trying, to understand how to move some money from what it was the Green Deal to the new package in relation to the new military policy of the European Union. So I think it's a mix of the two elements that you were mentioning before. Somehow, this package is related also to one consideration that was a little bit, which is inside the European Union policies, which is the concept of the administrative. We don't have to create policies and regulation which will generate high costs for companies to implement what is needed to be done in order to be compliant. And the main changes that we have in all the third legislation that I was mentioning at the beginning are taking into consideration this. So basically, we have a big difference, for instance, in the threshold, in the economical threshold that are creating the obligation. For non-European companies, for instance, they raised the threshold from 150 million to 450 million turnover generated in the EU, with the other threshold in consideration of at least 250 employees in the European Union. So you see that the numbers are really changing. It's not a minor adjustment, because if you move from 150 to 450, it's totally different. And this means that we still want, at least for big companies, so the companies that have a real impact on the economies, to be compliant with all the regulation, but we understand that for smaller companies, this will be really, really challenging.
Very, very, very interesting. So I guess that some of these companies anyway had already started preparing, right, for the reporting requirements. So how are organizations in Europe now interpreting these moves, and how should they sort of continue, if at all, their ESG and compliance effort in the face of these updates?
So as you know, if you are talking about CSRD, which is really the hot topic now, big companies in these days, basically they are presenting their new sustainability report, let's say, as part of the financial reports. And they were putting a lot of efforts in collecting all the information that it was required as it first year inside the European standard, the SERS. What are these companies doing? These companies are a little bit concerned. For very big company, what we call wave one company, the biggest challenge is now to understand how they have to manage the information they have gathered so far. Because one of the main elements that will change, that probably will change, is about the inclusion of decarbonization strategy inside the contents of the sustainability report. And as you can understand, it's really, really a tricky moment, because from one side, we were working on designing transition plans, on designing how we have to achieve this transition plan. And I know the transition plan is also part of your job. So you understand how much work it's needed to have credible and reliable transition plans. And on the other side, now maybe this transition plan will be less important for the upcoming regulation and for the upcoming sustainability report. So best practices now in Europe, at least for very big compliance company, is to maintain the collection of data they have collected so far, to keep doing it also voluntarily, because at the end of the day, the ESG framework, which in Europe is very, very strict, it's something that it's relevant also in the worldwide competitiveness of the company, because financial institutions, financial players want to understand the ESG impact and risks, of course, of the companies. So companies are reacting, doing their job. Small and medium enterprises now are much more like at the window waiting to understand what will be their future, because taking into consideration that also the investment in terms of people, in terms of time, in terms of infrastructure, IT infrastructure, it's something that companies were trying to program. And now with these big changes, probably something will change.
I see. It's really a matter of being able to keep focus on sustainability in the face of the fear of overinvesting in climate data collection and transition plans too early. Probably it would be useful to look at the risks, if at all, companies face if they treat these policy updates as a pause and slow down or even stop their commitments. Pietro.
I think that we have to see the omnibus as an opportunity somehow. Let me explain a little bit better. Of course, the frameworks oblige company to do something very, very specific, and everybody agrees, talking about CSRD, that the data point, the quantity of information required by CSRD is really too much and too detailed. On the other side, you mentioned risk and opportunities, and sustainability and decarbonization is about risk and opportunities. So I honestly think that the decarbonization pathway of companies, small, medium, and big, should not be affected really by the change of the regulation in Europe, because in the sustainability, in the decarbonization, they can really find a new way to be more competitive in the market. They can enter other markets. So I think that companies should assess on how to balance their sustainability journey with the economical results. Once again, I always want to remember that sustainability is about people, planet, and profits if we use the 3P paradigm. And so we really have to keep in mind that the economical side of sustainability is something which is very, very important for all the companies. So I think that company, yes, should, let's say, relax a little bit, get loose on the data management required by the regulation, but on the other side, if they have integrated in their business model, in their vision, something related to sustainability, so if they want to achieve a goal, if they want to be carbon neutral in the very next decades, and if they think it's relevant for the companies and for the value chain, including the customers, this should not be stopped by this shift in regulation. Of course, the pathway to get to the data collection can change, but yes, companies still should follow the pathway to decarbonization. Decarbonization and in general sustainability can be really something that creates value for all the companies.
100%. Couldn't agree more. At the same time, we are seeing global trade and politics getting reshaped by the new US administration, with new tariffs shaking up the trade system, ESG policies being openly condemned, Some shifts in the EU were already underway before the November election, as we know, but a potential economic slowdown from these tariffs could change how companies and governments set their priorities. So, do you think this could impact the EU's green agenda as well going forward?
I think that we have to keep in mind a few elements here. One is that the European framework and how Europe has been addressing the topic of climate, it's totally different from United States. Because in Europe, we have mandatory schemes. So some companies are obliged to do something, basically to reduce their emission or to buy allowances to emit. On the other side, the American model has always been based on incentive. So this is a totally different world. For sure, what is happening now in the United States, in general, in relation to climate policies, I was reading this morning a lot of news about how the Trump administration is trying to shut down some regional programs, the Californian program or small ETS around the states, plus the tariff are shaping a new world. Talking about tariff, we also need to talk a little bit about the CBAM. Okay, because the CBAM is this new regulation in Europe where we want to put a price on the embedded carbon of goods produced outside the European Union, taking into consideration our own carbon leakage risk, meaning that we should go away to, companies should want to go outside of the European Union to produce in order not to pay for the CO2, but on the other side, we want also to push external stakeholders and external governments of third-party countries to create some carbon policies. And this is something which, besides what is happening with the tariff and besides what is happening in the States, it's a huge movement now because we have the UK designing its own CBAM, we have Canada thinking about that. The negotiation about Article 6 are still moving and they are increasing every day the number of agreements based on the provision of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. So I don't see, honestly, a direct connection from the Omnibus proposal and what is going on in America in relation to climate policies now. For sure, also in consideration of the European policies where we have the concept who is polluting has to pay. This will be a challenge for European companies when it comes to outside of the Europe markets, because for sure the cost of production, the marginal cost of production will be higher than goods produced in countries when this is not applying. Plus the tariff, it's a very complicated also for policymakers now to shape the future of the economy. I mentioned before the Draghi Report, which is the basis of the Omnibus Package, it was a clear message to the European Commission that something should change in order not to reduce the competitiveness of European companies. So for sure the policymaker in the next months, but I would say in the next year, really need to understand how to support eventually the European companies to go on with the decarbonization journey that has started already and that we cannot stop.
Definitely. So to sum up, the landscape in which companies are operating today is evolving from both a policy and an economic landscape perspective. And in some cases, it is evolving not only fast, but in a rather unpredictable way. So what is your advice for companies to navigate such uncertainty?
For European companies, it's for sure very, very important to understand how the strategy that they have defined so far is aligned to the requirement as they are known now and how they will be probably in the future. For non-EU companies, the most relevant implication now are, okay, if you have a big economic interest in the European Union, so the threshold that I was mentioned before, you really need to get ready because you will have to report following the CSRD. On the other side, non-European company will be asked from European partners or European importers to provide information about their sustainability or their ESG performance in general. Depending on the directive, we need to collect some environmental metrics or also some social metrics. This is in relation, for instance, to the CSDDD, and especially it's true in consideration of the CBAM. We haven't talked a lot about the CBAM. The changes in the regulation of the CBAM in the Omnibus Package are related to exclude, let's say, minor volumes of goods imported inside the European Union. So the new threshold is set to volume of 50 tons of CO2 embedded, which is a good value, but the statistics say that this new threshold will exclude basically 90% of the small importers, European importers, but still we will cover the 98% of the imported goods and of the emissions embedded that we are importing. So if you are a non-EU producer and you are exporting to the European Union and your flow are big, your economic interest is big, you should keep doing what you were doing now. So you should try to understand the volume of your embedded emission. You have to engage eventually with your supply chain, because you know already that probably you have to collect some information of at least some precursors from your suppliers. So especially for non-European companies, the impact of the Omnibus regulation are very, very little so far.
I see. Any further advice that you would like to provide to companies trying to understand what is happening in EU from a climate policy perspective and how they can keep up to date and ensure business continuity should that be a market of their interest?
Companies should try to keep the pace with all the regulation and following the legislative evolution. This is not a weekly job. I mean, there are a lot of news about the omnibus, new interpretation, proposal. Companies should also participate in the consultations, in the stakeholder consultation, and there are a lot now. And it's very, very important to give a specific point of view, because we have to remember that policymakers sometimes they lose a little bit the contact, let's say, with reality. We have all the 2025 for this, so there are really a lot of consultation coming up in the next months, and the participation of direct stakeholder is fundamental. Then, as I said, if you have already started a sustainability journey, if you have integrated some ESG criteria in your strategy, you have to go on with this, because in the medium long term, this will give you a real advantage in your national market, in international market, and also if you are trading, let's say, or if you're working within the European Union.
Thank you very much, Pietro. This has been extremely insightful and very, very helpful. I would like to thank all of our listeners also in this episode of Sustainability Unplugged with Pietro Valladuzza, CEO of Kickstart Group. Thank you again, Pietro.
Thank you, Jessica.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation, and if you did, stay tuned for the upcoming episodes. Until next time, I'm Jessica Scopacasa, and this is Sustainability Unplugged by Olive Gaea.